So recently, I reconnected with someone from whom I shouldn't have disconnected. It was a new friend at the time, about five and a half years ago. We're going to call him Jim. It's not his name, but we're going to call him Jim for the purposes of this video. I met Jim while hanging out with a couple of other friends. They were mutual friends, it turned out. I can't remember the specific reason we were hanging out. And the reason why is because Jim struck me with such a wonderful impression. He's one of those people that has something that overshadows everything else that's going on around you. Almost everything that's going on around you. What it was that Jim had at the time and now, and really through most of my life, and most of my life I've not realized it, he had something I wanted. More than anybody I'd ever met, Jim seemed to be at peace with himself and the world around him. He seemed to be able to wear this world around all of us like a loosely fitting garment, more so than anybody I'd ever met. Jim had something I wanted. So a couple days later, I was talking to one of the guys that was there. I asked him about Jim. And I mentioned these things I just mentioned to you, and I was like, what's this guy's story? And he said, look, Jim will be more than happy to tell you. I'll give you his number, call him. He's big into meditation. We kind of kid around with him and call him the Zen master, but he's really into this. He's really what most people would call enlightened, and he loves talking to people about it, and he loves showing people how to do what he does. So I called Jim, and he was more than happy to get together with me the next day at his house. I went over to his house, and again, this is about five and a half years ago. I had just gotten back to the U.S. after living overseas for many years, better part of a decade. And Jim's about 15 years older than me. He's a Caucasian male. He lived alone. I found this out when I got to his house. Lived alone, no wife, no kids. Little brick rancher in one of those neighborhoods built in the 1950s. All the houses kind of look the same. Went inside his house, immaculately kept. There was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. And he just gave off this aura of everything in my life is as it should be. And it just drew me to him even more. So we got to talking, and after some simple pleasantries, he got right to the point. He said, so do you want to know why I'm like this? Do you want what I have? And I said, yes. And he said, okay. It's called Zen. You know, the guys goof off, they call me Zen master. What Zen basically is it's the mind without the mind. And I'd never heard that. I'm like, is this like meditation and all this stuff? And he said, well, that's kind of how you get there. And I guess in the past, like a lot of you watching this video, I've erroneously thought I'd meditated before. Like this, being out in the woods, just kind of focusing on a tree, focusing on a squirrel, focusing on a beautiful flower, and not thinking about anything except what I was seeing. I shared this with Jim, and he shared with me about how I was almost right, but not quite. He said when you meditate, mind without mind is you push out all thoughts, and it's very difficult to do, to actually sit there and think of nothing, have no thoughts at all in your mind. And I asked him, what really is the purpose of this? And if you're not thinking of anything, how does this make you like calm and collected? You know, I thought it was like training your mind to just always be positive, think of positive thoughts. And he said, no, he says, you got to think of your mind as a dumpster, and it's full of garbage. These are your negative thoughts, your regrets of your past, the fears of your future, your resentments towards others, your hate, all these things. Your stinking thinking, as he called it, and I've heard that term before. He says when you meditate, when you try to achieve Zen, mind without mind, you push all this garbage out of your dumpster. You want to have it completely empty. If you catch yourself thinking of anything, even if it's that beautiful flower, or that cute little squirrel in the woods, or whatever may or may not be right back here in this area right now, push that out as well. Mind without mind. So he teaches me the proper form. like how to sit on your shins, proper spine posture, how to lower your chin just a bit. You don't want to be entirely comfortable, because if you get too comfortable, you'll fall asleep. So there's this certain posture he taught me that keeps you from getting so comfortable you actually fall asleep. You don't want to sleep, you want to meditate. So I would meet with Jim a couple times a week, and I did this for several weeks, and I saw a lot of quick gains at first. I shared with Jim before we even got into this stuff about, being in war in Iraq, the terrible things that happened there, the terrible things that happened at home while I was absent, without going into detail here. What it was like living in the Philippine Islands for nearly 6 years, some of the bad things that happened there, and then coming home to a life that was nothing like the life I had when I left nearly a decade before. And it was driving me crazy. And he laughed. He said, "You were already crazy." And he had a point. He said, "Look, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your past is, what your present is, or what your future circumstances are. If you can't be mindful with nothing in your mind, if you can't just focus on the now and realize that everything in your life right now, like this, is perfect and as it is, as it should be." Something called Tah Tah Tah. Tah Tah Tah, that's Buddhist for thusness. And remember this, keep this in mind, because this is a big part. This is a huge part of our story coming up. Tah Tah Tah. Thusness. All is well. Doesn't matter what happened in the past. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Right now, I'm not hungry, I'm not cold, I'm not hot, I'm comfortable, I'm at peace with the world around me. One of the ways I stay here is by pushing all the garbage out of my mind and not allowing it back in. He explained about being an empath, of which he is one, and he explained I was one as well. And that's why we've got to be very careful with who we surround ourselves with, because if we get around people who are negative, we will suck up that negativity like a sponge does water. We're perfect targets for narcissists because we're a one-stop shop for those guys and girls. They can just tell us how great they are, tell us how much we suck, tell us what all's wrong with the world, how they would fix it if they were king or queen. Got to stay away from them. So much instruction, so much education. So at any point, I made big leaps, big gains for the first few weeks, but then I felt like I was stuck. There was some particular problems, parts of my past that I just couldn't get over. And we were at Jim's one day, and I was so frustrated, and he was telling me, it's a lot like losing weight. The 10th pound you lose, if you're trying to lose weight, is so much harder to lose than the first 5 pounds. When you first start, you change your diet, you start exercising, you change your lifestyle, the weight drops off quickly. But then once you kind of plateau, it's harder and harder to take off each pound. It's the same thing with meditation, trying to achieve Zen. He said, be easy on yourself. And this is kind of why this is where the disconnection happened. I just wasn't ready for what Jim had to offer, and I kind of said some things that were not pleasant. I judged him. I didn't know a whole lot about Jim. I was there self-seeking, and I told him, I said, yeah, well, it's easy for you to say. You never fought in a war, and you don't have a wife here, no kids, wife to nag at you and then leave you if you complain about her complaining, and then kids that just scream and distract you all the time but then rip your heart out when they're taken from your life. And he didn't say anything, and he didn't even change his facial expression, and that kind of made me even more angry, and I left. And I didn't see Jim for about 5 years. And then I just went back a couple of weeks ago because Tah Tah Tah. You hear that? Tah Tah Tah. There it is again. We're getting to that. Just pay attention. At one point, one meeting I had with Jim, he was talking about this whole empath thing and having achieved Zen. He told me that he could kind of read frequencies off of both people and animals. He said that if he were out in a crowd, or if he were in a restaurant or in a store, he could tell who was really stressed out, who was having problems. It was like static. He could pick up on what seemed like static coming off of these people. He could tell who would rather be somewhere other than where they were. You know, if he saw a couple at a restaurant and the wife's talking about her day and the husband's thinking about where he'd rather be watching a game, or vice versa. And he told me that one time he was even around one guy that had some sort of odd, really crazy static coming off him, and it scared him. He was terrified. And I asked him what he did in that situation. And he said, well, I didn't know what to do because I didn't know what was going on in this guy's mind. But it seemed evil, it seemed dangerous. He said he followed the guy home, and he got out on the highway, reached a very high speed, and careened his car off the road and hit a tree, and it was over, lights out. And so I asked Jim, I said, so you think what you were picking up on this guy was he was thinking about ending it all? And he said, no. He said, my thinking brain wanted to think that. He said, but it was more than that. It wasn't self-harm I was reading, it was pure evil. So he said he watched the papers. A couple of days later, there was a story in the paper about this single vehicular accident. Guy was killed, the driver was killed, and the police found in his trunk 3 shotguns, 2 handguns, and over 1,000 rounds of ammo. And Jim, to this day, says that he feels that guy had some pretty wicked plans, and he kind of convinced himself not to carry out these plans, and the only way to keep himself from doing this was to do what he did do, that single vehicular accident. And then Jim said, and then there was that one time, and then he stopped. He just stopped cold in his tracks. And this is why I went back to see him, because this is what I've thought about over the last year and a half or so, since we've had, or nearly 2 years, since we've been having some very strange things going on around here in these woods. I've thought of this several times, and it drew me back to Jim a couple of weeks ago. Now, back then when this happened, I said, Jim, come on, you can't leave me hanging. After that story, you gotta tell me about that other time. And he said, well, you know, I was leery to tell you the last story because I was afraid I might come across as looking as if I had superhero abilities. But if I tell you this next story, you're going to think I'm a complete nut. I said, come on, man, tell me. And we happened to be in the woods behind his house, which is not close to here, but it is attainable there. You can get there by foot in the woods without ever crossing a road or anybody's personal properties, if you're willing to walk for the better part of a day. So, I mean, he lives 15 minutes drive from me, but our woods are connected, okay? So we happened to be in the woods that day. He said, here, have a seat. We were walking a trail. I sat on the end of an old red oak log. He sat on the other end. And he said, you know, with people, it's frequencies. It's like static from a radio. He said, with animals, it's like hues, tones of color. If I'm out here, and he spends a lot of time meditating in the woods, like I've been doing this morning. He says if there's an animal in duress or stress, under stress, he says I see like reddish, dark pink tones. If there's happiness, I see bright green, shades of yellow, vibrancy. But if they start going towards orange and reddish, he gets into anger, you know. So he goes on and on. And he says, but there was this one time, he says, I was in the woods, these woods, different part. He says, I was meditating. I was trying to block out the hues of colors. And then I heard what sounded like, not static, coming from a person. And my mind's eyes wasn't seeing colors or tones, but my mind's ears heard Tah Tah Tah. And I was like, Tah Tah Tah, what is that? Is that like a broken language, a dead language? And Jim said, I know exactly what it is, and that's what's scary. I said, well, what is Tah Tah Tah? Jim explained to me that in Buddhism, Tah 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 means thusness. All is well. The here, the now. Focus on this, nothing else. Clearing that dumpster of its garbage, your mind's dumpster. Push it all out except here and except now. Tah Tah Tah. I said, what in the world do you think sent you that transmission? And why? And he says, well, he says, it's odd. I'm really good at this meditation thing. And he told me he's gone to camps where people would go and they'd pay money to go stay at like a camp for like a week straight where they'll sit around and meditate for like 8 hours straight. I mean, I couldn't imagine this. He says he has, in the last 20 years, he's never been able to, not clear his mind. But that particular day, he was thinking of some things he just couldn't clear his mind from. And that voice, what sounded like a broken language, came and it said, "Ta ta ta." Thusness, the here, the now. Focus on this. Clear your mind. And that made sense to me. But again, I asked Jim, what is it that you think sent you that transmission? And I'm thinking, and this is why I went back to see him, I'm thinking potentially it was Bigfoot Sasquatch. The answer he gave me, I'm not sure if it confirmed my suspicion or if it leaves even more of a mystery or a riddle. He looked at me and he said, "I don't know." I was like, come on, man, you can't keep me hanging like this. It wasn't a person, wasn't an animal. What was it? Was it something in between, a missing link? And I even said the words, do you think it was potentially Bigfoot Sasquatch? And he said, once again, "I don't know." This is the kind of guy, if he's not for sure, if he's not certain, he doesn't take the sucker bet. He doesn't go out on a limb. He doesn't even tell you what his hunch might be. He didn't know, so he didn't speculate. He made no assumptions. That's something else I really admired about Jim. I've always been such an assuming guy, and the end of my story here is going to prove this. Jim and I walked back to his house that day. I was saying goodbye, and this was a couple of weeks ago, okay, when I went back to see him, and I told him, I owe you an apology. This happened so many years ago. And he said, yeah, I remember. He says, don't worry, I've held no grudge. I've held no resentments. And I said, well, I figured you didn't. That's not your way. That's not Zen, and that's not ta ta ta. But I did want to apologize. And I brought up this conversation with him about this experience or this situation when we were out there in the woods. We sat on the logs. He told me this story. I brought it up when I went back and re-met with him here a couple of weeks ago. And he said, yeah, I remember. And I said, 5 years have passed. Have you had any change of thoughts of what it may or may not have been? And he said, no, I haven't. I still don't know. He said, I have heard it again during times when I couldn't clear my mind. And I said, it's curious. I never thought of this until now, but, you are the Zen master, like our buddies say. And you, of all people, seem to wear this world around you like a loosely fitting garment. It's like nothing can bother you. What possibly could have been going on from time to time that keeps you from being able to clear your mind, that keeps him, her, it, or they from coming to you and saying, ta, ta, ta? He said, have a seat. He went into the other room and he brought back a photo album. I started flipping through it and I saw pictures of him from many years ago when he was a much younger man. There was a beautiful woman and there were 2 beautiful children. It was a family. It was Jim's family. It was Jim's family I never knew he had. And I'm flipping through, I'm watching as the kids go from being babies to being 5, being 6. But they didn't get any older, and then the photos ended. And I said, Jim, I'm at a loss. I said, here, I thought you were like never married, no kids, you were a single man, you're so at peace, you couldn't have, seems as if you could have never had a problem in the world. What's this? What's going on? Who are these people? And he says, that's my family. He said, I was married and I had a couple kids, and they were taken from me too early. He said they were hit and killed by a drunk driver years ago, and well, I've never remarried. I didn't have any more children. I've just continued forward with my life, and I figured out, I sought out ways like you to be at peace with myself and to be at peace with the world around me, despite hardships, despite my past. I'm not my past. I don't know what my future might bring. I focus on now. I focus on thusness, being in the moment. I focus on ta ta ta. And at times, when memories, when resentments, when they come up, I can't clear my mind. Someone or something out there sends me a reminder. Ta ta ta. Thanks for joining us for another episode. PBS S. The potential Bigfoot Sasquatch show.